The sky over Assam was the color of oxidized copper, streaked with bands of monsoon gray that hadn't broken in 3 weeks. Lieutenant James Mackenzie gripped the control stick of his P-51 Mustang, feeling the engine's rhythm through his palms as if it were his own heartbeat. Below, the landscape of Burma sprawled in chaotic beauty, dense jungle interrupted by rivers that looked like quicksilver snakes coiling through vegetation, so thick it seemed impenetrable. At 06:32, his wingman's voice crackled across the radio, distorted by static and the perpetual hum of aircraft engines at combat altitude. "Lead, I've got contacts. 11 o'clock, 2,000 meters out. Japanese bandits. Looks like Zeros." Mackenzie's jaw tightened. He had been expecting this. The Japanese had been increasing their sorties over the past 6 days, probing Allied defensive perimeters with the persistence of insects testing the integrity of a screen door. He banked his fighter slightly, adjusting course to intercept, and felt the familiar weight of prepared violence settling into his stomach. 19 years of life had prepared him for this moment, though he had spent the first 18 of those years knowing nothing of aerial combat. James Mackenzie was born in Corpus Christi, Texas, on March 14, 1925, the only son of an aeronautical engineer named Charles Mackenzie, who had worked for the growing aviation industry before the war. His father was a meticulous man, the type who spent hours explaining the principles of lift and drag to a young boy while sketching diagrams in the dust of their driveway. "An airplane," his father had told him countless times, "is not magic, James. It's mathematics made material. Every surface, every angle, every adjustment serves a purpose. Those who understand the purpose will outfly those who merely know how to push buttons." Growing up in South Texas during the 1930s meant watching the expansion of aviation like witnessing the opening of a new world. Mackenzie had spent countless afternoons at airfields, watching biplanes give way to monoplanes, observing as speeds increased and designs became sleeker, more purposeful. By the time he was 14, he could identify any American aircraft by silhouette alone. By 16, he was sketching modifications to wings in his spare time, inspired equally by his father's engineering lectures and by his own obsessive study of aeronautical theory. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been a distant thing initially, something that happened to other people in other places. But by March 1942, Mackenzie had enlisted in the Army Air Forces, drawn by the same sense of purpose that had driven him to master every aviation textbook he could find. His aptitude tests placed him in pilot training immediately. At 06:47, barely a month after he'd submitted his application, he was sitting in a classroom in Mississippi, listening to a grizzled flight instructor explain basic aerodynamics as if most of his audience hadn't already slept through the same material in high school. Mackenzie had graduated top of his class, earning his pilot wings in January 1944 with commendations for both technical proficiency and exceptional judgment. He'd been assigned to the 14th Air Force, the same unit flying operations over China, Burma, and surrounding territories. The 14th was famous and infamous, primarily through its association with the Flying Tigers, the volunteer pilots who had flown for the Chinese government before American entry into the war. Those men, by all accounts, flew with a different kind of intensity, a quality of improvisation and ruthlessness born from fighting in an isolated theater with minimal support. At 07:12, Mackenzie had arrived at the aerodrome at Assam, India, fresh from the States with an undeserved confidence in his own abilities. The ground crew had watched him climb out of the transport plane with barely concealed amusement. He was fresh. He was untested. And there was something in his careful way of examining the airfield that suggested he didn't yet understand that theory and practice were sometimes separated by a gulf as wide as the Pacific itself. His commanding officer, Major Richard Chen, who had himself been a veteran of the Flying Tigers, had given Mackenzie a simple brief on his first day. "The Zeros are more maneuverable than your Mustang. The Zeros are faster in climbs. The Zeros are more reliable in the thin air at high altitude. But your Mustang is tougher, faster in level flight and has better visibility. You will succeed by flying to your advantages and avoiding their strengths. You will die if you try to match them, turn for turn." Mackenzie had nodded, memorizing the words, believing he understood them completely. He didn't understand them at all. Understanding came later, usually at the moment when understanding was least useful. His first combat engagement came on February 19, 1945, over the Irrawaddy Valley. 4 Japanese fighters had been reported heading toward the airbase, and Mackenzie and 2 experienced pilots had been scrambled to intercept. At 07:43 approximately, they had spotted the bandits descending through broken cloud cover. Mackenzie had felt his pulse accelerate, that primal surge of adrenaline that no amount of training could adequately prepare a pilot for. The engagement lasted perhaps 4 minutes. When it ended, one of the Japanese fighters was falling toward the jungle, trailing black smoke, and Mackenzie understood with perfect clarity that he had not killed it. His superior, Captain Thomas Webb, had opened fire on Mackenzie's target after Mackenzie had already initiated his attack run. The kill had been credited to Webb, though they both knew the truth. Mackenzie had wasted precious ammunition in poor positioning, climbing when he should have dived, overestimating his aircraft's turn radius as he attempted to follow a zero through a maneuver that was literally impossible for his machine to execute. That evening, after debriefing, Mackenzie had sat alone in the ready room studying performance specifications and aeronautical diagrams with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The problem was becoming clear to him, crystallizing into focus like a photograph developing in chemical solution. The Japanese aircraft were superior in certain tactical domains. That superiority could not be overcome through force of will or aggressive flying. The only solution lay in innovation, in finding technological advantages that transcended pure aeronautical capability. His mind had begun to work in different directions, exploring possibilities that existed at the margins of regulation and doctrine. By early March, AT-0802, Mackenzie had started conducting what he referred to privately as optical experiments, studying how light behaved at various altitudes, how reflections could be manipulated, how the human eye performed under different illumination conditions. He had begun salvaging materials from damaged aircraft, accumulating a small collection of reflective surfaces, optical elements, and other components that seemed to have no immediate military application, but whose potential he sensed was somehow significant. His commanding officers had begun to notice his solitary nature, his tendency to spend off-duty hours in the maintenance hangars rather than with the other pilots. Major Chen had pulled him aside one afternoon and suggested, with the delicate firmness of someone speaking to a subordinate showing signs of instability, that Mackenzie might benefit from more social engagement with his squadron mates. Mackenzie had agreed politely and done nothing whatsoever to follow the suggestion. The regulations prohibiting unauthorized modification of military aircraft were explicit and extensive. They existed for practical reasons: standardization of equipment, maintenance compatibility, weapons safety, and the general principle that individual pilots should not treat military hardware as personal laboratories. Mackenzie understood the logic. He also understood with increasing conviction that the logic was incomplete, that rules created for ordinary circumstances sometimes became obstacles in extraordinary ones. By mid-March, Mackenzie had assembled the preliminary version of what he was thinking of as his brightness apparatus, a modification to the ventral surfaces of his Mustang that would allow him to deploy light in specific patterns designed to temporarily disorient and blind opposing pilots. The device was crude, assembled from components that technically belonged to Army equipment, even if their current configuration did not. Using it would violate multiple regulations, would certainly result in investigation if discovered, and carried risks he was not yet fully prepared to calculate. He had not yet decided to use it. He was simply, he told himself, conducting research, understanding potential, exploring theoretical advantages that might eventually be pursued through proper channels, if those channels ever became receptive to innovation emerging from frontline pilots rather than engineering offices thousands of miles behind the lines. The Burma campaign of 1944 and 1945 was by most accounts a sideshow. While the major theaters of war consumed strategic resources and commanded media attention, the air war over Burma and the surrounding territories operated in relative obscurity, a grinding attrition where victory was measured in incremental gains and survival was frequently the most significant achievement. The Japanese maintained numerical superiority in the region, through a combination of forward-positioned air bases and a doctrine of aggressive defense that prioritized holding territory regardless of cost. Against this opposition, the 14th Air Force was spread thin, its pilots flying multiple sorties daily with maintenance crews working around the clock just to keep aircraft in flyable condition. At 06:19 on March 23rd, Mackenzie received new operational orders. The directive came from 20th Bomber Command, transmitted through Major Chen with the flat tone of a man who understood the limitations being imposed, even as he transmitted them. All offensive operations were to be suspended pending reallocation of resources. Fighter squadrons would henceforth operate in defensive patrol mode exclusively, engaging enemy aircraft only when they threatened friendly forces or critical installations. Ammunition consumption was to be reduced by 40% through stricter engagement protocols. Pilots were instructed to avoid unnecessary fuel expenditure and to prioritize aircraft preservation over aggressive tactical engagement. The logic was not difficult to discern. The war in Europe was entering its final phase. Resources that had once been dedicated to the Pacific and China-Burma-India theaters were being redirected westward. The assumption, stated nowhere explicitly but understood by every pilot in the squadron, was that the Burma campaign would essentially hold its current positions until Europe was secured, at which point resources might be allocated more generously. Mackenzie listened to the briefing with mounting frustration. The orders were not merely defensive in character. They were actively constraining, removing from pilots the ability to dictate the terms of engagement. Japanese aircraft could probe, test, withdraw, probe again, with the knowledge that American pilots could respond only after being attacked or after demonstrating direct threat to installations. It was like tying one hand behind a boxer's back and then expressing disappointment when he lost rounds to an opponent using both hands freely. The immediate effect of these new orders manifested over the following 2 weeks in a pattern that became grimly familiar. July 07:04 on April 4th, a Japanese reconnaissance flight photographed the Assam Air Base for the third time in 5 days. The Americans could not attack. At 06:57 on April 9th, a flight of Zeros swept across the valley, where 3 American pilots were conducting routine patrol, forcing them to retreat without engaging, because protocol required that they avoid combat unless directly attacked, and 3 aircraft dispersed over a wide area did not constitute direct threat to a critical installation. The Zeros turned toward the airbase itself before dispersing, and then the Americans could pursue, but by then the Japanese were already climbing toward altitude, where the engagement would be conducted under terms favorable to enemy aircraft. By mid-April, morale in the squadron had deteriorated noticeably. Pilots who had been aggressive and confident began exhibiting signs of fatalism. The subtle shift in demeanor that came from understanding that the rules of engagement had been rewritten to favor the opponent. 2 pilots requested transfer. One pilot, experienced and previously reliable, had filed a complaint with Major Chen about what he termed doctrinally imposed cowardice, a formal protest that accomplished nothing except to create permanent documentation of his insubordination. Mackenzie observed all of this with the clinical detachment of someone studying a system that was breaking down under the weight of its own contradictions. He flew his assigned patrols, maintained his aircraft with meticulous attention, and said nothing about the frustration that was building inside him like pressure behind a dam. Privately, his mind was working in different directions. The key insight came to him at 08:23 on April 18th during a routine maintenance inspection of his aircraft. He had been walking the line of Mustangs with the crew chief, a sergeant named Robert Gaines, who had been maintaining aircraft since before Mackenzie had even enlisted. Gaines had pointed out a deteriorating seal on one of the landing gear doors and mentioned almost conversationally that the supply situation for replacement parts had become so dire that they were cannibalizing components from damaged aircraft to keep the active fleet flying. "We've got 3 birds in the boneyard," Gaines had said. "That won't fly again. Might as well strip them for parts before they rust beyond recovery." Mackenzie had examined the damaged aircraft, his mind already beginning to process possibilities. Among the wreckage was a crashed reconnaissance aircraft, a P-5 Lightning variant, with optical systems designed for photographic work. The aircraft was barely salvageable, but its components were another matter. The flare-dispensing mechanisms from the cargo hold were intact. The optical systems were damaged, but not destroyed. The electrical systems could be repurposed. That evening, Mackenzie had approached Major Chen with a carefully crafted request. He had proposed, in terms that emphasized their theoretical and training value, the development of an updated flare dispersion system that might provide superior coverage for night operations. He had framed it as a technical exercise, something that could be pursued during maintenance downtime without consuming resources designated for operational flying. He had been deliberately vague about the specifics, and Major Chen, likely too overwhelmed by the multiple competing demands on his attention to interrogate the proposal thoroughly, had given informal approval with the caveat that Mackenzie should not allow the project to distract from operational duties. Over the following weeks, Mackenzie had worked in the maintenance shed during evening hours when the facility was less crowded. He had salvaged components from the damaged reconnaissance aircraft. He had acquired, through methods he did not examine too closely, samples of phosphorescent compounds from chemical supply stores. He had studied how light behaved at various altitudes and how the human eye performed under conditions of temporary bright illumination, followed by darkness. The scientific principles were not entirely different from what he had learned studying aerodynamics. Light was in many ways predictable. It could be manipulated, directed, amplified. By late April 0708, Mackenzie had assembled a prototype device that could be mounted to the exterior of his Mustang. The system would allow him to deploy light in specific patterns, intense enough to temporarily disorient an opposing pilot, by exploiting the eye's natural sensitivity to sudden bright illumination. The device itself violated no specific regulation, but its installation on military aircraft certainly did. The electrical connections had to be integrated with systems that were strictly controlled. The mounting points required modifications to the fuselage. Any competent maintenance technician examining his aircraft would immediately recognize that modifications had been made. Mackenzie had not yet installed the device on his own aircraft. He was still, he told himself, in the experimental phase, understanding potential, preparing for possibilities that might eventually need to be acted upon. Though he remained uncertain whether he possessed sufficient moral authority to make such decisions unilaterally. The maintenance shed was quietest after 2200 hours, when the day crews had departed and the night shift was concentrated on the flight line performing essential service work. Mackenzie had deliberately scheduled his modifications for these hours, working in a corner section that was ostensibly devoted to equipment inventory, but which he had gradually claimed as his personal workspace. By early May, AT 0642, his device was no longer theoretical. It was real, functional, and waiting for installation. Captain Thomas Webb had discovered him there on the evening of May 5th, working by flashlight, while examining the mounting brackets he had fabricated from salvaged aluminum. Webb was a different category of pilot than most, someone who had flown combat missions in the European theater before being transferred to the Pacific. He had seen enough of military operations to understand that rules sometimes created more problems than they solved. He had looked at Mackenzie's device for perhaps 30 seconds before asking a single question. "Does it work?" Mackenzie had paused, considering how to answer, settling finally on direct honesty. "Theoretically, yes. It deploys intense light in controlled bursts. The effect should be sufficient to temporarily blind a pilot during critical maneuvering. Disorientation lasting perhaps 2 to 4 seconds, which might be enough to break an aggressive attack sequence." Webb had examined the mechanism more closely, his experienced eye recognizing the quality of engineering despite the crude assembly. "That's going to get you court-martialed if anyone official sees it," Webb had said quietly. "I'm aware of the regulations," Mackenzie had replied. "Awareness and acceptance are different things," Webb had countered. "The question is whether you're prepared to actually use this thing, or if you're just building it to feel like you're doing something." Mackenzie had not answered immediately. Webb had nodded slightly, as if the silence was itself an answer, and had turned to leave. At 0654, Webb had paused at the entrance to the maintenance shed and spoken over his shoulder without turning around. "If you do use it, you'll need reliable spotters who understand what's happening. You can't be alone in this. The moment you activate that system in combat, you're involving your crew, and they deserve to know what they're part of." Over the following 2 weeks, Mackenzie had refined the system, replaced corroded connections, and tested the electrical components repeatedly without actually installing the device on his aircraft. He had also, in carefully indirect ways, begun conversations with two people he had come to trust. The first was Sergeant James Caldwell, who served as his spotter and forward observer when Mackenzie was assigned to ground support missions. Caldwell was a former engineer, trained in radio communications, and trained even more importantly in recognizing when orders conflicted with tactical reality. The second was First Lieutenant David Morrison, who served as Mackenzie's occasional wingman and who maintained the kind of philosophical independence that suggested he might be receptive to unconventional approaches to problematic situations. Mackenzie had raised the topic delicately, beginning with theoretical discussions about aircraft performance limitations, progressing to abstract discussions about the ethics of following orders that seemed counterproductive, and eventually approaching something resembling direct communication about what he was considering. At 0703 on May 19th, Caldwell had asked him directly, "You've built something, haven't you? Something that violates about 6 regulations." Mackenzie had decided that the time for ambiguity was past. He had shown Caldwell the device, explained the mechanism, described the intended effect. Caldwell had studied it with the careful attention of someone who understood the consequences of what Mackenzie was proposing. "If this doesn't work," Caldwell had said, "you'll face charges. If it works and saves lives, you'll still face charges. But at least the outcome will have been positive." "Those are the only 2 possible results," Mackenzie had confirmed. "Then you should think carefully about whether you actually intend to use this or whether you're just building it as a form of protest against orders you disagree with." The answer had come sooner than Mackenzie had anticipated. At 0617 on May 23rd, Major Chen had convened an emergency briefing for all operational pilots. Intelligence had indicated that the Japanese were preparing a major strike against the Assam facilities. The attack was expected to occur within the next 72 hours. Fighter squadrons would maintain continuous alert status. Offensive operations remained suspended under existing directives, but pilots were authorized to engage any enemy aircraft that approached within striking distance of critical installations. The briefing had included specific intelligence about the composition of the anticipated attack force. 19 Japanese fighters were expected to participate in the initial assault wave, primarily Zeros, but with at least 3 newer Nakajima Ki-84 variants, which represented the most advanced Japanese fighters currently operating in the theater. The attack profile suggested they would approach at high altitude, conduct a diving attack against parked aircraft and facilities, and attempt to withdraw before American fighters could achieve effective interception. Mackenzie had listened to the briefing with a clarity of purpose that had previously eluded him. This was not a theoretical exercise anymore. This was not preparation for some eventual circumstance that might never materialize. This was happening now within hours or days, and the existing protocols under which he was supposed to operate would likely result in significant losses among both aircraft and personnel. After the briefing had been dismissed, Mackenzie had returned to the maintenance shed. It was at 0738. He had begun the installation process immediately, working with methodical precision to mount the device to his Mustang. The installation required approximately 3 hours of work, and he had completed it by 23:42, working alone and making certain that the installation was invisible to any casual inspection. The electrical connections ran through existing bundles of wires. The mounting points were concealed by the aircraft's natural contours. The device itself was compact enough to remain hidden unless someone was specifically looking for modifications. Lieutenant Morrison had appeared in the maintenance shed at approximately 0130, having apparently been unable to sleep. He had watched Mackenzie work in silence for several minutes before speaking. "You installed it," Morrison had said. It was not a question. "I did," Mackenzie had confirmed. "And you're going to use it when they come." "If they come," Mackenzie had said. "If the engagement circumstances permit." Morrison had nodded slowly, understanding what Mackenzie was not saying directly, that Mackenzie was preparing to break direct orders, that he was committing to a course of action that would certainly result in formal investigation and probable disciplinary action if it became known, that he was making this choice unilaterally, without authorization, without consultation with command authority. "Your spotter needs to know," Morrison had said. "He needs to understand what he's going to observe and what it means." Mackenzie had met with Caldwell privately, 8:06:09, on the morning of May 24th. He had explained the installation, demonstrated the activation mechanism, and outlined what Caldwell would observe if the device was deployed. Caldwell had listened without interruption, then had asked a single practical question. "When you activate it, how will I know? I won't be in the aircraft seeing the effect directly. The electrical discharge will be visible as a brief flash from the aircraft," Mackenzie had explained. "And the effect on the Japanese pilots will be observable through binoculars. They'll break formation. Their flight patterns will become erratic. They'll lose coordination temporarily." Caldwell had considered this, then had nodded with the resignation of someone accepting a burden that he understood but could not prevent. "Then we're committed," he had said. "If the Japanese come, if you engage them, if they see what you've done, we both face consequences." "That's accurate," Mackenzie had confirmed. The waiting had been its own form of torture. Throughout May 24th, Mackenzie had remained in standby status, his aircraft positioned for rapid launch, his mind cycling between conviction and doubt. The Japanese did not attack. Throughout May 25th, the same tension repeated itself. By the evening of May 26th, the expected attack still had not materialized. Intelligence had reported that Japanese air operations in the region had been disrupted by weather, logistical difficulties, and unspecified tactical considerations. By May 27th, AT-0802, the immediate threat assessment had been downgraded. The anticipated attack was considered unlikely to occur within the current operational window. The alert status remained elevated, but was no longer immediate. Mackenzie had considered removing the device from his aircraft, restoring it to a hidden installation for later use or eventual disposal. But he had not taken action. The device remained mounted and ready, its electrical systems charged and functional, waiting for a combat situation that might never arrive. The radio crackled with urgency at 03:58 on June 2nd. Mackenzie was in the ready room, reviewing flight plans for the day's scheduled patrols, when the alert klaxon began its wailing protest. The Japanese were coming. Radar had picked up a substantial formation approaching from the northeast, altitude approximately 18,000 feet, course directly toward the Assam facilities. "All pilots to aircraft," the squadron commander's voice came through speakers, mounted throughout the base. "Scramble, scramble, scramble!" Mackenzie moved with automatic precision, the routine of combat preparation having become almost meditative through repetition. He collected his flight jacket, his helmet, the small personal items he carried on every mission. As he jogged toward the flight line, he was aware of his hand brushing against the ignition mechanism for the device mounted beneath his fuselage. The contact was brief, almost unconscious, but it grounded him in the reality of what he had already committed to doing. The aircraft were positioned in their alert positions, engines already being started by the ground crews. Mackenzie climbed into the cockpit of his Mustang, a particular aircraft he had designated as his regular mount, the one on which he had installed the unauthorized system. Caldwell was already in position at the forward observation post, headset active and ready for communication. Lieutenant Morrison was climbing into the adjacent aircraft, his movements deliberate and controlled. "Flight 1, this is ground control," the voice came through Mackenzie's headset. "Bogies are now 8 miles out, altitude 19,000, still approaching base. You are cleared for immediate launch." Mackenzie ran through the pre-flight checklist with mechanical efficiency, his mind compartmentalized between the immediate procedural requirements and the deeper awareness of what was about to happen. The engines caught cleanly. The electrical systems responded. His modified device was armed and ready, its capacitors charged, its optical system primed. At 04:02, his aircraft lifted from the runway, the wheels retracting into the fuselage almost immediately. The formation of American fighters climbed steeply, pursuing the rapidly ascending Japanese aircraft. Intelligence had provided accurate data about the attack formation. 19 Japanese fighters, exactly as predicted, configured for a diving attack against ground targets. "Ground control, this is Flight 1 lead," Mackenzie transmitted. "I have visual on the bandits, closing rapidly. The radio response was immediate. Flight 1, maintain pursuit, but do not engage until they commit to attack. Repeat, do not engage until they are inside the perimeter. Mackenzie understood the protocol. The orders existed for tactical reasons. Aircraft defending installations needed to maintain positioning that allowed them to intercept inbound attackers during their attack runs. Engaging them at altitude, away from the base, might not achieve the defensive objective, but the protocol also meant allowing the Japanese to dictate terms of engagement, to maintain the advantage of altitude and position until the moment when American pilots would have to fight uphill against superior positioning. At 0408, the Japanese formation initiated its attack. The lead elements pushed over into steep dives, their engines screaming as they accelerated downward. They were committed now. They could not abort the attack run without losing the opportunity they had created. Mackenzie had seconds to make his decision, maybe less. Follow protocol and allow them to attack while he climbed to intercept, or break protocol and engage them now while they were vulnerable during the transition from level flight to diving attack. Mackenzie reached forward and activated the device. The effect was immediate and visible. From Caldwell's position on the ground, the device's discharge was brilliant. A concentrated burst of intense illumination that made several observers involuntarily shield their eyes. For the pilots in the Japanese fighters, descending rapidly with their attention focused on their bombing runs, the effect was catastrophic. Several of the leading Zeros broke formation immediately, their pilots instinctively pulling up to escape, what they interpreted as anti-aircraft fire directed at their positions. Two of the fighters collided as pilots maneuvered wildly to avoid what they perceived as a threat. The formation disintegrated into chaos, individual pilots reacting independently to the perceived attack rather than maintaining coordinated assault profile. "What the hell was that?" came Morrison's voice over the radio. "Some kind of flak." "Not flak," Mackenzie responded, understanding that his next words would trigger consequences he had already accepted. "Continue pursuit. Do not allow them to regroup." The American fighters were suddenly in a superior tactical position. The Japanese formation was broken, their coordinated assault disrupted, their individual pilots confused about the nature of the threat they had encountered. Mackenzie pressed his attack, his superior speed in level flight allowing him to rapidly close distance on the nearest Zero. The engagement lasted approximately 12 minutes. By the end, 4 Japanese fighters had been shot down with absolute certainty. 3 others were damaged sufficiently that they withdrew toward their home base, streaming smoke and managing only marginal control. The remaining aircraft scattered, some climbing vertically, some diving toward the jungle below, all of them abandoning any coherent assault pattern. Caldwell's voice came through on the ground frequency. "All Japanese aircraft are now departing the area. Attack formation is broken. No aircraft have reached bombing positions." 80-0421, Mackenzie landed his aircraft. As he was taxiing toward the parking area, he could see ground crews and maintenance personnel gathering near his aircraft. Word had obviously spread quickly about what had happened, though the full details would not yet be known to most of the base personnel. Major Chen was waiting for him at the flight line, his expression unreadable. Behind Chen stood 2 officers Mackenzie did not immediately recognize, one wearing the insignia of a senior technical officer, the other bearing the uniform of base operations. "Pilot Mackenzie," Major Chen said, his tone formal and careful. "You are to report to interrogation immediately upon aircraft shutdown. You will leave your flight equipment with the crew chief and proceed directly to headquarters." The interrogation room was a small, austere space with minimal furnishings and deliberately harsh lighting. Mackenzie was seated across from Major Chen and the 2 officers he had seen at the flight line. The senior technical officer was identified as Colonel James Whitmore, attached to Army Air Force's Engineering Division. The second officer, a Major Patterson, represented base operations and rules compliance. "You deviated significantly from established protocols during the recent engagement," Major Patterson began, his tone accusatory. "You activated some form of offensive system without authorization. You engaged enemy aircraft contrary to direct orders limiting combat to defensive scenarios. You may have compromised the structural integrity of military equipment through unauthorized modifications. What do you have to say regarding these allegations?" Mackenzie had anticipated this moment. He had known it was inevitable from the moment he had begun installing the device. "I engaged enemy aircraft that were attacking this installation," he said calmly. "I used equipment that was installed with the intention of providing tactical advantage during combat situations. The engagement was successful. All attack aircraft were either destroyed or driven away before reaching bombing positions." "You violated direct orders," Major Patterson repeated, his voice hardening, "regardless of the outcome." "The orders prevented effective defense of this installation," Mackenzie replied. "The attack was only repelled because I was willing to violate those orders." Colonel Whitmore had been silent until this point, studying Mackenzie with careful attention. Now he spoke, his voice measured and professional. "I want to examine this equipment you deployed. Show me what you built." Mackenzie was escorted back to the flight line under guard, though the guard was more ceremonial than restrictive. His aircraft was still parked in the maintenance area. The ground crew had begun conducting post-flight inspections and had obviously noticed the modifications. Mackenzie directed Colonel Whitmore and several technical personnel to the device mounted beneath his fuselage. The colonel examined it with methodical attention, tracing the electrical connections, examining the optical elements, manipulating the mechanical components to understand how the system functioned. "This is crude," he said finally, "but it's also remarkably well engineered for field construction. Where did you acquire the technical knowledge to design something like this?" "My father was an aeronautical engineer," Mackenzie explained. "I studied optical systems extensively before the war. The basic principles of light manipulation are not complicated. I had access to salvaged components and the motivation to apply them practically." "And you did all of this knowing it violated multiple regulations," Whitmore said. "Yes," Mackenzie confirmed, "because the regulations prevented effective response to tactical threats." Whitmore looked at Patterson, some form of silent communication passing between them. Finally, Whitmore spoke. "You're going to be formally reprimanded for the unauthorized modifications and for violating engagement protocols. That's unavoidable. However, your tactical judgment in this specific instance appears to have been sound. We need to understand this system better. Once the reprimand is processed, you're going to be assigned to work with our engineering division to document how this device functions and assist in developing improved versions." Mackenzie understood that he had simultaneously achieved victory and accepted punishment. The system had worked, the attack had been repelled, but the institutional response would be neither simple nor entirely favorable. The formal investigation into Mackenzie's conduct commenced at 06:42 on June 3rd, merely hours after the engagement that had repelled the Japanese attack. The investigation was conducted with surprising efficiency, suggesting that Colonel Whitmore's interest in the technical aspects of Mackenzie's device had already begun reshaping the institutional response to what might have been treated purely as a disciplinary matter. Mackenzie was subjected to extensive questioning about the device's construction, its operational parameters, and the technical principles underlying its function. He provided detailed explanations, diagrams, and component inventories. The investigation also examined the combat engagement itself, interviewing other pilots who had participated in the interception, examining gun camera footage, and reviewing radar data. At 07:09 on June 5th, the investigation concluded with the issuance of a formal reprimand documenting that Mackenzie had engaged in unauthorized modification of military equipment and had violated direct orders regarding engagement protocols. However, the reprimand also included a section noting that Mackenzie's actions had resulted in the successful defense of critical installations and had prevented significant loss of life and materiel. The reprimand was filed in his permanent record, but it was notably less severe than charges related to similar violations during previous military operations. More significantly, the formal reprimand included transfer orders. Mackenzie was being reassigned to a special technical unit operating under Colonel Whitmore's direct authority. The new assignment would place him in a role focused on development and refinement of the optical device system, field testing of improved versions, and technical consultation regarding deployment to other fighter squadrons operating in the Pacific Theater. Sergeant Caldwell was reassigned with Mackenzie, as was First Lieutenant Morrison. creating a small team with existing knowledge of the system's capabilities and limitations. They relocated to a technical facility at 0803 on June 10th, beginning a new phase of work that was simultaneously advancement and exile from normal operational flying. The technical work proceeded rapidly. Army Ordnance engineers, working from Mackenzie's original design, developed improved versions incorporating better optical materials, more robust electrical systems, and mounting configurations that could be applied to multiple fighter aircraft types. By mid-July at 0728, prototype systems had been installed on 8 additional Mustangs, flown by other pilots in the squadron. The results exceeded initial projections. Pilots using the modified systems reported that the light deployment was effective at ranges exceeding their expectations. Japanese pilots encountered the systems with increasing frequency and began developing tactical responses, primarily by attempting to approach from angles where the light deployment would be less effective. But the fundamental advantage remained with the American pilots, who possessed the ability to deploy a weapon that exploited sensory vulnerabilities. By the end of August, Mackenzie's systems had been credited with contributing to the destruction of 27 additional Japanese aircraft through direct engagement or tactical disruption. The number was conservative, representing only those kills where the connection to the light deployment system could be clearly established. The actual influence on the air campaign was likely substantially greater. 0617 on August 15th, Japan announced its surrender. The war in the Pacific ended not with the climactic invasion that military planners had been preparing for, but with the shock of atomic weapons and the sudden collapse of Japanese military capability. Mackenzie was stationed at an airbase in Okinawa when the news arrived. The reaction from the pilots around him was complex, mixing relief and something approaching grief for the loss of purpose that had structured their existence for years. Demobilization proceeded through the autumn of 1945. Mackenzie was honorably discharged at 0804 on October 31st, having served 3 years and 8 months. He returned to the United States as a first lieutenant with the Silver Star for valor, though the citation carefully avoided detailing the specific circumstances of the action that had earned him the decoration. The transition to civilian life was disorienting. Mackenzie attended the University of Texas on veterans' benefits, initially uncertain about his direction. By his 3rd semester, he had committed to studying aeronautical engineering, following a path that had been implicit in his interests since childhood. He graduated in 1949 with honors and immediately found employment with an aircraft manufacturing company in Southern California. The post-war years saw rapid advancement in optical technology, driven by military investment in sophisticated systems far beyond what Mackenzie had improvised from salvaged components. Nonetheless, his wartime work became part of the technical foundation upon which more advanced systems were built. Several of the engineers he worked with in civilian industry had been involved in evaluating his original device, and they recognized in his approach a particular perspective that had value in practical problem-solving. In 1952, 0731, Mackenzie filed his first patent application for a civilian hunting scope incorporating principles similar to his wartime modification. The patent was granted in 1954. Using that foundation, Mackenzie founded his own company, Mackenzie Optical Systems, in 1955. The company remained small, but developed an excellent reputation for precision optical equipment used in hunting, wildlife research, and search and rescue operations. By the 1960s, Mackenzie had deliberately kept his company independent and privately held, avoiding military contracts and the bureaucratic entanglement that such work entailed. "I've seen what happens when innovation becomes absorbed by institutional processes," he had explained in a 1968 interview with an aviation trade publication. "Sometimes the best solutions come from people willing to work outside established systems. My goal is to maintain that independence while still producing quality equipment." Throughout his adult life, Mackenzie maintained contact with several of the people who had shared his wartime experience. Lieutenant Morrison became a test pilot for a major aircraft manufacturer. Sergeant Caldwell entered law enforcement and eventually became chief of police in a small Colorado town. The three men corresponded regularly, their letters often reflecting on how their military experiences had shaped their approach to authority, innovation, and institutional change. At 06:53 on June 2, 1972, exactly 27 years after the combat engagement that had defined his military career, Mackenzie received an invitation to speak at the infantry school at Fort Benning, Georgia. His case had been declassified and was now being studied as part of a curriculum on battlefield innovation and adaptability. The Army wanted him to address a class of officer candidates about the balance between discipline and initiative in combat situations. Mackenzie had initially declined. Uncomfortable with public recognition of actions he had long considered private and somewhat regrettable. However, Colonel David Palmer, who was directing the curriculum development, had persisted in his requests. Palmer sent Mackenzie copies of the case study materials and explained that multiple generations of officers had already encountered Mackenzie's story through military education channels. Public acknowledgement would allow Mackenzie to contextualize his own experience rather than allowing it to be interpreted exclusively through institutional frameworks. At 07:09 on July 18, 1972, Mackenzie stood before a class of 42 officer candidates at Fort Benning and addressed them for the first time publicly about his wartime decision to violate orders. "Rules exist for very good reasons," he had told them. "They provide structure, they enable coordination, they prevent chaos. But circumstances sometimes arise where following the rules leads to outcomes that are clearly wrong. The challenge is knowing the difference. It requires understanding not just the letter of the rule, but the purpose behind it. If the purpose is being defeated by the rule itself, then you may need to consider action outside the rule, but understand that doing so carries serious consequences. I faced investigation, formal reprimand, and permanent documentation of my violation of orders. The outcome in my case happened to vindicate my decision, but that's not always how these situations resolve. The speech had been documented and transcribed. Over the following years, it had been reproduced in military journals and included in various leadership training curricula. Mackenzie's willingness to discuss both the justification for his actions and their costs had helped shape the evolution of military doctrine regarding field adaptability and authorized tactical modifications. In 1984, the Army initiated the first comprehensive review of its protocols regarding equipment modifications in the field. The process explicitly referenced the Randall incident from World War II and the Mackenzie incident from the Pacific Theater as historical examples of how institutional rigidity could prevent effective response to tactical situations. New directives were issued allowing unit commanders to authorize necessary tactical adaptations to meet specific battlefield conditions, provided those adaptations were documented and reported through proper channels. On May 8, 2020, exactly 75 years after the end of the European War, the United States Army Night Vision and Electronic Sensors Directorate at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, held a ceremony dedicating their innovation laboratory in Mackenzie's name. Mackenzie was 95 years old at the time and unable to attend, but representatives from his company and family were present. The dedication plaque bore a quote from his 1972 speech at Fort Benning. "The greatest threat in combat is not enemy strength, but our inability to see beyond our own limitations. Innovation often requires courage to challenge established systems, but that courage must be tempered with understanding of why those systems exist. The balance between discipline and initiative remains one of the most difficult challenges in military leadership."